sixth step of plug making is to complete the final shaping.
In the areas where the fiberglass skin has correctly assumed the shape of the vehicle, it can simply be sanded with 80 grit dry sandpaper to prepare it for priming. In our case, the plug needed quite a bit of final shaping to achieve the desired contours. The bottom of the plug was closest to being correct, so we started there. We added material to the bottom to level it and to the sides to smooth the transition with the bottom. Use some type of sight gauge to determine where the material needs to be added or removed. Here I use a straight edge to look for low spots.
Two circumstances existed at this stage which caused us to adjust the normal sequence of operations during the final plug shaping and mold construction. The first circumstance was the current shape of the plug. Although the framework had been designed with no negative angles, it had very little taper or draft to its sides. It was decided that the lower carbon body shell would be extremely rigid and in its present form difficult to release from the mold. Consequently, the mold sides needed a greater taper. The ideal place to anticipate this would have been during the design of the plug. However, this is the final stage to make any changes, and it is better to correct it now than to have the part stick in the mold or be damaged trying to force its release.
Following this line, I built a taper to a height of 3/8 of an inch over a 14-inch span per side using glass reinforced body filler. However, it had to be blended evenly from the bottom of the plug to the parting line and added another week to the project. The desired result was achieved though, and the material added 1.5 degrees of draft to each side of the plug.
The second circumstance which affected the final shaping of the plug was the timetable of the project. The sooner the students could receive the structural or bottom portion of the vehicle, the earlier they could begin final assembly and testing of the engine and other critical systems. In an attempt to compress the schedule and produce the lower shell earlier, only the bottom of the plug was fully shaped and surfaced before the lower mold was made. We then came back and surfaced the top of the plug. However, to teach these mold making techniques in the proper sequence, we will discuss finishing the plug in its entirety. When that is complete, we will proceed to mold construction.
As stated earlier, the bottom of the plug was finished first. We pick up now forming the top of the plug. To speed the shaping, I switched to a quick-setting drywall compound to rapidly blend the top into the bottom. This material dries in 20 minutes without cracking and sands easily. I'm using a fairly wide applicator where the sides are flat enough to allow it. This saves on sanding later. My shaping tools consist simply of 2 drywall sanding blocks of different lengths and many drywall sanding screens. Since the drywall compound is softer than the body filler I used on the lower portion of the plug, I am able to sand right next to the finished lower surface without changing its shape. This transition area is the parting plane which divides the two molds, and it cannot be altered. I am now sanding one of the last layers of drywall compound. I use a crosshatch pattern, a longer stroke, and a longer sanding block to make sure the flatter areas stay true. The switch to drywall compound probably saved a week's worth of work grinding on the body filler. I used a flexible drafting tool to check and recheck my contours from side to side. Cardboard templates could also be used, but I found this to be quick and accurate enough. Check every 6 to 12 inches depending on the length of the sanding block being used. I finished covering the plug with regular drywall compound to get the smooth finish and sanded it with 180 grit dry sandpaper. At this point, I blew the remaining dust off the car before checking all the measurements again. I knew that the shape that had been developed would be the final design of the vehicle.
After the plug achieves the proper shape, it must be covered with a material which can be sanded and polished to a high gloss finish. This is the final step of building the plug.
The drywall compound was sealed with a latex primer available at most hardware stores. This was sprayed on, then lightly sanded with 240 grit dry sandpaper. The product I am spraying now is an automotive epoxy primer, which I use to seal the entire plug surface. This epoxy sprays on easily, is extremely durable, and can be polished to a mirror finish. I first applied a light tack coat and let it dry. Then, we filled any visible pinholes with a very light spackling compound. We got this at the hardware store as well. It is easy to apply with your fingers, and the excess is removed with the palm of your hand. Next, I sprayed on a medium coat of epoxy primer to cover the spackling compound. This only sat long enough to tack up. I applied a final coat of epoxy primer to seal everything. The primer must be thick enough that later sanding operations will not cut through it. The plug sat for over 24 hours to be sure the epoxy had time to fully cure before sanding would begin. The sealed plug needs only sanding, polishing, and waxing to be ready for mold construction. While the surface may appear fine, a closer inspection usually reveals a slight orange peel texture. This texture, along with any other minor flaws, must be sanded off the plug or it will be transferred to the mold surface. Begin using 240 grit wet sandpaper and a wet or dry sanding pad. Clean the paper frequently with water to remove dust and to lubricate the plug's surface. Rinse the entire surface with clean water, dry, and inspect. Do not proceed to the next grade of paper until all the orange peel texture has been removed. When only 240 grit scratches remain, move on to the 320 wet paper to remove them. Use consecutively finer grades of paper until the scratches are very fine. We stopped after using 600 grit paper and washed the plug again. The plug now has uniform fine scratches over the whole surface and is ready for buffing. Next, we spread machine glaze over it. With clean terry wipes, we hand buffed the surface because a machine polisher was not available. I personally recommend renting a machine polisher. Not only does it make the job easier, it polishes to a higher luster as well. Number 11 parting wax was then applied to the plug, allowed to haze, and buffed off. A total of 6 coats of wax were applied, allowing the wax to harden for an hour between every 2 coats.
The resulting waxed plug is now ready for the upper mold to be constructed. This shape is exactly what the final vehicle will look like. It has a very high quality surface finish, free of scratches, and is bonded securely to the supporting layers below. The plug is now complete. It is identical to the desired shape of the finished car in every detail. We are now ready to identify the parting plane and build the separation flange. It is this line which will separate the top from the bottom mold half. As we explained when finishing the plug, we had to construct the bottom mold as soon as the bottom of the plug was finished. As a result, this step of constructing the parting flange was performed when the plug was only partially finished.
Due to the size and the taper toward the nose of the vehicle, a full-size parting board was not constructed as it was in our molding fiberglass video. It was still necessary to create a flange which would follow the parting line and separate the mold halves. 14 inches from the bottom of the plug was a crest or waist, which was the widest portion of the model. This was the parting plane, which would divide the plug into the upper and lower mold halves. Please note that the plug is resting upside down awaiting molding. Also note the wax Formica board screwed to the back, forming the flange at the rear of the mold. Using modeling clay, we constructed a 3-inch deep shelf around the entire perimeter of the plug. I used a razor blade to smooth the clay, making sure that I didn't hit the surface of the plug. The shelf was supported with more clay and cantilever triangle supports made of sheet metal. The shelf needed the triangles to support the weight of the molding materials used to construct the flange. Since the plug was already waxed, it was ready for PVA. The clay shelf and the entire exposed half of the plug were then sprayed with PVA. 3 light coats were applied to the highly waxed surface and allowed to dry. The mold surface should appear uniform and dry before continuing to molding. At this time, the lower mold was constructed off camera and removed from the plug. Later in this video, we will document the construction of the top mold in detail.